4 kilometers per second. That is approximately how fast the pyroclastic density current traveled down Mayon Volcano's Miisi Gully on May 2nd, 2026. 52 villages, 5,000 evacuees, the largest single flow event of the year. And the official alert level, which has not moved in 4 months, stayed exactly where it was. Here is why that matters more than the flow itself. The last time Mayon's alert level did move, 90,000 people had to be evacuated. The time before that, an entire town was erased from the map, and only a bell tower survived. Mayon is currently on a trajectory consistent with both of those outcomes, and it is not telling us which one is coming. If this already has you asking questions, hit like and subscribe to the Skylab because this story is nowhere near finished. The alert level is still frozen at 3, the gullies are still loading, the events are still compounding, and somewhere between the official statement of no significant change and the largest flow event of the year, there is a gap that somebody needs to keep filling in. That is what we do here. You are going to want to be here when the next update breaks. Now let us get into it. Part 1. The contradiction. Something happened on May 2nd, 2026, at 4:28 in the afternoon, Philippine Standard Time, that should have changed everything, and officially, it changed nothing. That is the story we are telling today. Not just what happened, but what it means that the people watching it most closely looked at the largest single mass movement event of the year on one of the most active volcanoes on the planet and said, in their official language, that there had been no significant change. Let that sit for a second. The biggest event of the year. No significant change. We are going to spend the next while working out how both of those things can be true at the same time, and why the answer to that question is more terrifying than either one of them alone. So let us start with what actually happened, because the specifics matter enormously here. At 4:28 in the afternoon, a portion of recently deposited lava near the summit of Mayon Volcano in the Albay province of the Philippines gave way, not because of a dramatic explosion from below, not because of a sudden spike in underground pressure that sent magma rocketing toward the surface. It gave way because it was heavy and hot and perched on a steep slope, and gravity, which does not care about alert levels or official statements, simply won. The structural failure sent material cascading down the Miisi Gully, one of Mayon's primary drainage channels on its southwestern flank, and what followed in the next few seconds was what volcanologists call a pyroclastic density current. We will get into exactly what that means in a moment, because the mechanics are important. But first, the numbers. In roughly 22 minutes, between 4:28 and 4:50 in the afternoon, the collapse triggered strombolian bursting activity at the vent above, and the pyroclastic density current, the PDC, traveled approximately 4 kilometers down the Miisi Gully. 4 kilometers in seconds. The material moving through that gully was not just falling rock, it was a self-sustaining flow of fragmented lava, hot gas, and volcanic ash moving faster than you could run, faster than most vehicles could accelerate from a standing start, and hot enough to kill instantly at contact. The ash plume generated by the event rose to roughly 3,000 meters above sea level and drifted westward and southwestward, carrying fine volcanic particulates over a wide swath of the surrounding region. By the time the flow had slowed and the plume had begun to disperse, 52 barangays, that is the Filipino word for villages or local administrative units, had been affected by ashfall. More than 5,000 people were being moved into evacuation centers. Emergency responders were already deployed. The regional government of Albay was coordinating the response, and the Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology, known universally as PHIVOLCS, the agency responsible for monitoring Mayon, around the clock with an array of seismic sensors, GPS deformation instruments, gas analyzers, and satellite data feeds, issued an official statement. Alert Level 3. No significant change. Now, I want to be very precise about what I am doing here, because this matters. I am not criticizing PHIVOLCS. These are professional scientists doing an extraordinarily difficult job with real data under real conditions. and we will spend significant time later in this video explaining exactly why their statement is technically accurate. But the contradiction is real, and it is the entire reason this event is worth discussing at length, because it reveals something fundamental about how volcanic monitoring works, how the public understands it, and where the gap between those two things creates genuine danger. The largest event of the year just happened. The alert level did not move. What does that tell us? It tells us that alert levels are not measuring event size, they are measuring system state. And right now, the system state at Mayon Volcano has been stuck in a particular range for nearly 4 months since January 16th, 2026 to be exact. And on May 2nd, the system produced something bigger than it had produced before and still fit within that range, which raises the question that is going to haunt the rest of this video. What happens when it does not? Because here is the thing about a volcano that has been running at a sustained elevated state for 4 months while producing progressively larger events. Either this is normal behavior for a system that will gradually wind down the way Mayon did in 2023, or it is not normal behavior and the events are getting larger because something is changing underneath, building towards something that the instruments have not yet clearly flagged. And the data right now, today, is consistent with both interpretations. The volcano is not telling us which path it is on. That is what makes it dangerous. And before we can fully understand why, we need to talk about what a collapse-fed pyroclastic density current actually is, because it is not the same as the explosive eruption most people picture when they hear the word volcano, and that difference is more important than almost anything else in this story. Part 2: Collapse versus explosion. Most people carry around a mental image of a volcanic eruption that comes from movies, disaster documentaries, and the kind of dramatic footage that gets millions of views online. There is usually a massive explosion, a column of ash and fire shooting into the sky, lava fountaining dramatically from the summit, and the whole thing building to an obvious climax. That image is not wrong exactly. It describes one type of volcanic behavior, but it is not what happened on May 2nd, and it is not what has been making Mayon dangerous for the last 4 months. What happened on May 2nd was a gravitational event, not an explosive one. Fresh lava material that had only recently extruded from the vent and built up near the summit became structurally unstable. You can think of it like this. Imagine stacking warm, slightly sticky bricks on a surface that is already tilted at a steep angle, and imagine doing that for weeks on end while more material keeps being pushed up from below. At some point, the pile does not need a trigger from beneath to fail. It just becomes too heavy, too steep, and too unstable, and it goes. That is what happened. The collapse was gravitational in origin, not pressure-driven from below. Why does that distinction matter? Because it fundamentally changes how predictable the event is. When a volcanic eruption is driven by magma pressure building beneath the surface, the monitoring instruments have something to work with. Pressure moving upward deforms the ground, which GPS sensors can detect. It generates characteristic patterns of seismic activity. As it fractures rock on its way up, it forces gases ahead of it that spectrometers can measure at the surface. The build-up toward an explosive, pressure-driven eruption tends to leave fingerprints, not perfectly legible ones, and not always with enough lead time, but fingerprints nonetheless. Gravitational instability is different. A lava pile sitting near the summit of a steep stratovolcano can fail without producing a significant seismic spike beforehand. It can fail without major gas anomalies. It can fail without the kind of dramatic ground deformation that would trigger an alert level change. It can fail, in other words, without clearly announcing itself in the data streams that monitoring systems are designed to capture. The structural threshold for collapse is a physical property of the accumulated material. How much is there? How steep is the slope? How cohesive is the rock? And those properties do not always produce clean signals before they reach their limit. Now, once the collapse happens, the material does not just roll harmlessly down the mountain. Fresh volcanic material is still hot. it is still partially gas-laden. When it fractures and mixes with the surrounding air during a high-velocity fall down a steep gully, it can generate the conditions for a self-sustaining pyroclastic density current, which is a flow of gas, ash, and fragmented rock that behaves more like a fluid than a solid. It moves along the ground surface, it follows terrain channels, and it is dense enough to travel far beyond where simple ballistic physics would suggest the material should stop. The current is what makes this type of event dangerous at distance. You do not have to be at the collapse point to be in its path. This type of behavior, a collapse-fed pyroclastic flow, has been observed at other volcanoes around the world. Merapi in Indonesia has produced similar events. Soufriere Hills in Montserrat built a lava dome for years and then generated devastating collapses. The pattern is recognizable, and what it tells us is that a volcano can produce a highly destructive, fast-moving event without the kind of escalation in its deeper signals that would push a monitoring agency to raise the alert level. The collapse can occur at the current level of system activity. The danger is not in the magma itself, it is in the accumulated mass near the summit. And here is what makes that relevant to our central question. If the largest event of the year was generated not by a surge of fresh magma, but by the structural failure of material already sitting near the summit, then the size of that event is at least partly a function of how much material has accumulated, and material has been accumulating on Mayon's slopes since January, which means the next collapse could be larger not because the system's magmatic activity has escalated, but simply because there is more material sitting in an increasingly unstable position. A bigger pile falls farther. Is the next event going to be bigger? And if it is, will the instruments tell us before it happens? That question leads us directly into the 4 months of build-up that got us to May 2nd, because May 2nd did not come out of nowhere. It was the product of a sequence, and that sequence has a shape, and the shape of that sequence is what volcanologists are arguing about right now. Part 3, the sequence nobody wants to see. Volcanoes do not erupt in isolation. Every event is part of a sequence, and the sequence has structure, a timeline of escalating or de-escalating signals that, in hindsight, often tells a coherent story. The problem is that you are always living inside the sequence while it is happening. You do not get the hindsight while you are in it. You only see what has happened so far, and you try to infer what comes next. That is the fundamental challenge. And the sequence at Mayon in 2026 has a shape that can be read 2 very different ways. The observable sequence looks like this. Abnormal seismicity began in late December 2025. Not catastrophic, not dramatic, but a measurable uptick in the underground activity that PHIVOLCS instruments detected and noted. Alert Level 1 indicated a low-level unrest. On January 1st, 2026, the alert was raised to Level 2 as the signals continued to intensify. 16 days later, on January 16th, the alert reached Level 3 magmatic activity at the crater, hazardous eruption possible, and continuous lava effusion began. From that point forward, lava was moving out of the vent and flowing down the flanks of the volcano, loading fresh material onto slopes that already bore the deposits of previous eruptions. Over the following weeks and months, the pattern was consistent: seismic activity at elevated levels, continuous thermal anomalies visible from satellite, growing lava flow distances on multiple flanks, periodic rockfalls as the edges of the flows became unstable, and occasional small pyroclastic density currents as material crumbled away. Then, on May 2nd, the largest of these events occurred: a PDC that travelled 4 kilometres down the Meisi Gully, more than double what earlier events had managed. Now, here is where the interpretation problem becomes acute. That sequence from minor seismicity to elevated unrest, to lava effusion, to rockfalls, to progressively larger PDCs, appears in 2 very different types of volcanic episodes. It appears in episodes that are building toward a significantly more energetic eruption, where the PDC on May 2nd is just an intermediate step and not the climax. And it also appears in episodes that are simply expressing the sustained output of a magmatic system that is actively feeding lava to the surface without escalating toward a major explosive event. In the second scenario, the PDC on May 2nd might be near the top of what this episode is going to produce. In the first scenario, it is a waypoint. The distribution of event sizes over time is one of the things volcanologists look at when trying to determine which scenario is more likely. If the events were random in size, some large, some small, with no trend that might suggest a system in a kind of steady state, but if the events are getting progressively larger, if each successive significant occurrence is bigger than the last, that is a potential signal, not a definitive one, not a proof, but a potential signal of a system that is not in a steady state, that is evolving, that has not yet reached whatever equilibrium it is moving toward. The events at Mayon in 2026 have been getting larger. May 2nd was the largest, and that matters because the psychology of volcanology and the psychology of the people living around the volcano creates a particularly dangerous tendency. The longer a system stays at a given level without escalating, the more normalized that level becomes. The background becomes the baseline, and events that would have been alarming 4 months ago become routine. The monitoring agencies, the emergency managers, the residents, the journalists, everyone adapts to the current reality. This is what Mayon does, becomes the frame. And within that frame, even genuinely significant changes can be interpreted as more of the same. But the geography of what just happened adds another dimension to this, because the event on May 2nd did not just matter in terms of its size, it mattered in terms of where it went. And that brings us to the gullies and to a characteristic of Mayon's geography that turns a large event in one specific location into something very different from a large event in another. Part 4. The Gully Problem. Mayon Volcano is often described as one of the most perfectly conical volcanoes in the world, and visually, that description is apt. Its slopes sweep upward from the surrounding plain of Albay province in a nearly symmetric cone, and the shape is genuinely striking in a way that has made it a national symbol and a tourist landmark for generations. But that visual symmetry is somewhat misleading when it comes to understanding how the volcano actually behaves during an eruption, because the radial symmetry of the cone does not translate into a symmetric distribution of hazard. The reason is the gullies. Mayon's flanks are carved by deep, steep drainage channels, the result of millions of years of rainfall, erosion, and volcanic deposit accumulation. These gullies are not just topographic features, they are energy concentrators. When lava flows or pyroclastic material moves down the slope of the volcano, it does not spread evenly in all directions like water on a flat surface. It finds the channels. It follows the paths of least resistance carved into the slope, and once inside a gully, the material is funneled, accelerated by the confinement, carried farther than it would travel on an open slope, and directed at whatever is at the bottom of that particular drainage channel. 3 gullies have been particularly active during this episode of Mayon's behavior. The Miisi Gully on the southwestern flank, the Basud Gully to the north, and the Bonga Gully to the southeast. Lava flows have been advancing down all 3. As of the most recent data before May 2nd, the Basud flow had reached approximately 3.8 kilometers from the summit, the Bonga flow had reached roughly 3.2 kilometers, and the Miisi flow, the channel where the May 2nd collapse occurred, had already established material at about 1.6 kilometers before the collapse added dramatically to that distance. The collapse on May 2nd sent its pyroclastic density current down the Miisi Gully specifically. Residents in the communities closest to that gully's exit and along its path bore the brunt of the ashfall and were the primary evacuees. Communities near other flanks of the volcano were comparatively unaffected by the specific event, even though the overall alert level applies to the entire mountain. That asymmetry is important because it means that a single event, which looks from the outside like a volcano-wide occurrence, is actually a highly directional, location-specific threat. And here is where it connects back to our central question. When PHIVOLCS says there is no significant change, they are assessing the state of the whole system, the magmatic activity, the seismicity, the deformation, the gas output, and they are correct that those whole system parameters did not dramatically change around May 2nd. But the directional hazard, the specific danger in a specific direction on a specific day, changed enormously at the moment the Miyasi Gully collapse happened. Those 52 barangays did not experience no significant change. They experienced ash raining from the sky and evacuation orders and 5,000 people in emergency shelters. The alert level system, by design, cannot fully capture that asymmetry. It is a system-level measurement. The geography makes the local impact unpredictable in ways that the alert level, whatever it says, cannot communicate, which means that even within an unchanged alert level, the specific danger at any given location around the volcano can shift dramatically without warning, and the next time it shifts, it might be a different gully, in a different direction, affecting a different set of communities who had been watching the activity on the Miyasi side and thinking themselves relatively safe. That is the gully problem, and it leads us directly to one of the most important numbers in this story: 4 kilometers. Part 5. The boundary it almost reached. 4 kilometers is how far the pyroclastic density current travelled down the Miyasi Gully on May 2nd. It is also, and this is not a coincidence, it is precisely why the alert level did not change significantly less than 6 kilometers. Because 6 kilometers is the radius of Mayon's permanent danger zone. The permanent danger zone, or PDZ, is a circle drawn on the map around Mayon's summit at a radius of 6 kilometers in every direction. Within this zone, permanent residence is prohibited. The designation was established based on historical eruption data, looking at what Mayon has produced across dozens of documented episodes and determining what distance provides a meaningful buffer against the expected range of its activity. The PDZ is not an absolute guarantee of safety beyond 6 kilometers, but it is the boundary below which the risk is considered too high for permanent habitation. It is also the primary reference point for alert-level escalation decisions. When the May 2nd PDC travelled 4 kilometers, it stayed well inside the PDZ. That is actually critical information. The PDZ had already been cleared. The evacuation protocols for Mayon include mandatory evacuation of the PDZ at alert level 3, which has been in effect since January 16th. The communities that were most directly in the path of the May 2nd event had already been moved. That is why a flow of this scale, 4 kilometers of fast-moving, lethal pyroclastic material, did not kill anyone. The system worked as designed. The PDZ buffer, the pre-positioned evacuation, the monitoring apparatus, it functioned. But now consider the numbers more carefully. The PDZ boundary is at 6 kilometers. The May 2nd flow reached 4 kilometers. That means there is a 2-kilometer margin between where the flow stopped and where the permanent safety boundary ends. 2 kilometers that this particular event did not consume. 2 kilometers of buffer that stood between the largest event of the year and the threshold at which the alert level system would have been forced to respond more dramatically. Volcanologists are very aware of this margin. It is part of the assessment. A 4-kilometer run-out is concerning, but it is within the zone that was already evacuated, within the range of what a level 3 system can be expected to produce, and it does not push against the PDZ boundary in a way that would indicate an imminent change in behavior. In isolation, it validates the level 3 designation. The system is doing what a level 3 system does. But here is the tension that the raw numbers contain. The May 2nd event was the largest PDC of the current episode. Before it, the flows and PDCs had not reached 4 kilometers. The sequence is smaller events, then larger still, with May 2nd as the current maximum. If that trend continues, if the next significant event travels 5 kilometers and the one after that travels 6, then the margin evaporates progressively. And the crossing of the PDZ boundary at 6 kilometers would represent not just a change in alert level, but a change in the nature of the threat to populated areas beyond the PDZ. There is a concept in risk assessment called near-miss normalization. It describes what happens when an event comes close to a critical threshold repeatedly without crossing it. The near miss, instead of functioning as a warning, starts to feel like confirmation that the boundary is safe. We came close again, and nothing happened, which means we have established that coming close is okay. This is a deeply human cognitive response, and it is extremely dangerous in the context of systems that are not actually stable but are incrementally approaching a limit. The human brain interprets repeated near misses as evidence that the limit is robust. The volcano does not know the limit exists. So, where does this leave us? We have a system that has been at alert level 3 for nearly 4 months. We have lava flowing on 3 flanks. We have events that are getting larger. We have a PDC that travelled 4 kilometers on May 2nd, the largest of the episode. And we have a monitoring agency saying, correctly, that no significant change in system-level parameters has occurred. Every one of those statements is true, and together they describe a situation that is either approaching its plateau or approaching a threshold, and the data alone cannot tell us which, not yet. To understand why, we need to go back 4 months to where this episode started, how it evolved, and what makes its behavior unusual, even by Mayon's own historical standards. Part 6 Timeline Compression. Late December 2025 was, for most of the world, the holiday season. For the seismic monitoring network surrounding Mayon Volcano, it was the beginning of something that would last for months. The instruments started picking up what PHIVOLCS describes as abnormal seismicity patterns of underground activity that deviated from the baseline quiet that the volcano had been showing for most of the year. Not dramatic, not headline-grabbing, but statistically distinguishable from background noise in a way that trained analysts noticed. This is how volcanic unrest usually begins. Not with drama, but with small statistical deviations in data streams that most people never see. The seismic sensors there are multiple stations positioned around Mayon's flanks at various distances and elevations, started logging an increased frequency and sometimes increased amplitude of signals that are associated with magma movement and fluid migration in the volcanic system below, the surface. Not earthquakes in the conventional sense, volcanic tremor, discrete, low-frequency events, the language of a system awakening. By January 1st, 2026, the first day of the new year, those signals had intensified enough that PHIVOLCS raised the alert from level 1 to level 2. Level 2 means increasing unrest with potential for eruptive activity. It is a warning. It is a call to preparedness. It is not yet an evacuation order, but it signals that the scientific community watching this volcano has crossed a threshold in their own assessment of what is happening underground. Then, in 16 days, everything moved faster. By January 16th, the activity had escalated to the point where PHIVOLCS raised the alert to level 3. Level 3 is a qualitatively different category from level 2. At level 3, magma has moved sufficiently close to the surface that hazardous eruption is considered not just possible but probable. The crater is active, lava is at or near the surface, the permanent danger zone must be cleared. And continuous lava effusion, meaning lava was not just present but actively flowing out of the vent, had begun. From January 16th forward, Mayon has been continuously effusing lava. Every day for nearly 4 months, molten rock has been moving out of the summit vent and down the flanks of the volcano, loading fresh material onto the Basud, Bonga and Miisi gullies, building up the lava flows that PHIVOLCS tracks daily and reports in their updates. This sustained, continuous effusion is one of the key characteristics of the current episode, and it is unusual. Here is the thing about Mayon's history that makes the current episode stand out, even before you get to May 2nd. Mayon erupts frequently. It is one of the most active volcanoes in the Philippines, with dozens of documented eruptive episodes over the past few centuries. But most of those episodes are relatively short. Activity spikes, peaks, and subsides within weeks, sometimes within days. Sustained level 3 activity lasting 4 months is not unprecedented. The 2023 episode ran for a similar duration, but it is not typical either. Most Mayon episodes resolve faster than this one has. What sustained level 3 for 4 months means is that the magmatic system feeding Mayon has been continuously supplying material to the surface for nearly a third of a year without exhausting whatever driving pressure or magma volume is, maintaining the effusion. The supply has been consistent enough to keep lava moving without escalating to a dramatically more energetic eruption. And that consistency, that plateau of sustained elevated activity, is itself an anomaly that deserves examination. Because plateaus in volcanic systems are not inherently signs of stability. Sometimes a plateau is a system finding its equilibrium, expressing energy at a rate that can be maintained indefinitely without accumulating excess. But sometimes a plateau is a system that is building towards something slowly, without the dramatic spikes that would trigger alert escalation, accumulating energy or mass or structural instability in ways that will only become obvious when the next significant event occurs. And on May 2nd, we got the largest event of the episode so far, which brings the question into sharp focus: where is all of this going? But before we can answer that, or even properly frame it, we need to understand what 3 active gullies simultaneously loaded with fresh lava actually means for the stability of the cone itself. Part 7. The 3 gully system. One lava flow is a geological feature. 3 simultaneous lava flows on 3 different flanks of the same volcano is a logistical and structural problem, and it is one of the defining characteristics of the current Mayon episode that has not received as much attention as it deserves. Since the onset of continuous lava effusion in late January, PHIVOLCS has been tracking flow advancement on 3 separate drainage systems. The Basud Gully, on the northern to northeastern flank, saw lava advancing to approximately 3.8 kilometers from the summit as of the most recent measurements before May 2nd. The Bonga Gully, on the southeastern side, reached roughly 3.2 kilometers, and the Misi Gully, before the May 2nd collapse added dramatically to the distance of material in that channel, had lava advanced to about 1.6 kilometers, 3 separate flanks, 3 separate channels, 3 separate directions in which fresh, hot volcanic material has been depositing on the slopes of the cone. Why does the multi-flank nature of this matter? Because each flow is not just a hazard in its own direction, it is also a load. Fresh lava is heavy. As it accumulates on the steep upper slopes of Mayon, it changes the stress distribution in the volcanic cone. A single flow on one flank adds load asymmetrically. Multiple flows on multiple flanks add load more broadly, affecting the overall structural balance of the upper cone in ways that single flow episodes do not. This is not necessarily catastrophic. Mayon has hosted many multi-flow episodes before, but it means the structural context for any given collapse event is different from what it would be with a single, isolated flow. Think of it this way: each individual flow represents a column of material resting on a steep slope. The material at the base of the flow is supporting the material above it. As the flow advances further, the column grows longer, and the weight at the summit and the part connected to the vent where fresh material is being continuously added grows larger. At some point, the structural integrity of the accumulated lava at the flow front, or at a weak point along its length, fails. And that is how a gravitational collapse generates a pyroclastic density current. The May 2nd event was exactly this. The Misi flow had accumulated enough material in an unstable configuration that the structure gave way. Now here is the part that matters for what comes next. The Basud flow is at 3.8 kilometers. The Bonga flow is at 3.2 kilometers. The Misi flow, before May 2nd, was at 1.6 kilometers of accumulated material. After the collapse, some of that material is now further down the gully, but the vent is still effusing. More material is still being added. The flows are still growing. The piles are still getting bigger. A bigger pile falls farther when it collapses. The physics is not complicated, and the 3 gullies represent 3 separate accumulation systems, any one of which could generate the next significant collapse event and the one after that, and the one after that while the summit continues to supply fresh material from below. This is the cumulative build-up problem, and it is why the 4-month duration of this episode is not just historically unusual, it is structurally significant. The longer the effusion continues, the more material accumulates on the slopes. The more material accumulates, the more potential energy is stored in those piles, and the more potential energy is stored, the larger the collapse events can become without any change whatsoever in the deep magmatic signals that the monitoring instruments are designed to capture. But there is another data stream beyond the seismic and deformation measurements that has been painting a consistent picture since January, and it is one that does not always get the coverage it deserves. It comes from space, and it measures something that the human eye cannot see from the ground. Part 8. The thermal signal. There is a system called MIROVA, which stands for Middle Infrared Observation of Volcanic Activity, and it does exactly what the name implies. Using data from the MODIS and VIRS satellite instruments that circle the Earth in polar orbits, MIROVA continuously scans volcanic regions of the planet for anomalous heat signatures in the mid-infrared wavelength range. It does this in near real time, and it produces a record of volcanic radiative power, essentially how much heat is being emitted from the surface of a volcano that goes back years for each monitored system. Mayon's MIROVA record for the period before the current episode late 2024, and most of 2025 shows a baseline that is relatively quiet. The volcano was not completely cold, because active volcanoes rarely are, but the thermal anomalies were modest and intermittent. Then, starting in January 2026, the signal changed. The radiative power values increased substantially. The anomalies became persistent rather than occasional, and throughout the 4 months of Level 3 activity, the thermal signature from space has been consistently elevated, with notable spikes in approximately mid-February and again in mid-April periods when the surface lava expression appeared to intensify before settling back to the elevated baseline. What does a persistent thermal anomaly tell us? At the most basic level, it confirms what the ground observations also show. There is hot material at the surface, and there is a sustained heat flux from the volcano to the atmosphere that indicates ongoing magmatic activity at depth. The surface lava we can see in photographs and drone footage is connected to a heat source below that has been maintaining the temperature and the supply. The thermal anomaly is not created by surface lava. Sitting there slowly cooling lava would produce a declining anomaly over time. A persistent, elevated anomaly requires a persistent energy input, which means the magma supply to Mayon's system has been active and sustained since January. Now, one important limitation to be clear about. Thermal satellite data is extraordinarily useful for confirming the presence and approximate vigor of surface lava activity, and for tracking changes in that activity over time. What it cannot do is directly predict when an eruption will occur or what form it will take. The thermal signal does not distinguish between a system that is building toward a larger event and one that is simply expressing steady magmatic supply at a constant level. It shows the energy is there. It does not show what that energy is going to do next. But here is the connection back to the central question we keep returning to. The thermal signal has been consistently elevated for 4 months. It was elevated before May 2nd. It was elevated on May 2nd. And it will almost certainly still be elevated after May 2nd. This is one of the reasons that PHIVOLCS correctly states no significant change in system parameters, because the thermal data, the seismic data, and the deformation data have all been running at a consistently elevated level without dramatic spikes around the time of the May 2nd event. The event was large in terms of its mass movement and its impact on communities. It was not large, apparently, in terms of what it registered in the underground instrument network. And that, once again, is the exact contradiction at the center of this story. A system can look unchanged from space and underground while doing something new at the surface. The instruments track what they can reach. They cannot always capture the moment when accumulated material at the surface reaches its structural limit. And that limitation matters enormously as we try to understand why PHIVOLCS made the decision they made and what it would actually take to change it. Part 9. Why PHIVOLCS is not moving the alert level. This is the part of the video where some people expect me to say that PHIVOLCS is being complacent, or that they are underreacting, or that bureaucratic inertia is putting lives at risk. I am not going to say any of those things, because I do not believe any of them are true. What I am going to do instead is explain, as precisely as I can, what the alert level system is designed to measure, what it is not designed to measure, and why the decision to hold at level 3 after May 2nd is scientifically defensible while simultaneously acknowledging that defensible is not the same as comfortable. The Philippine alert level system for volcanoes runs from 0 to 5. 0 is background quiet. Level 1 is low-level unrest. Level 2 is increasing unrest with potential for eruption. Level 3 means magma is at or near the crater, and hazardous eruption is possible, which is where we currently are, and have been since January 16th. Level 4 means eruption is imminent. Level 5 means a major eruption is in progress. The specific criteria for moving from level 3 to level 4 are defined around a set of observable signals. PHIVOLCS is looking for rapid ground inflation deformation of the volcanic edifice that indicates magma is moving quickly toward the surface and pressurizing the system from below. They are looking for a significant spike in seismic activity, particularly the kind of high-frequency seismicity associated with rock fracturing under magmatic pressure. They are looking for a major increase in sulfur dioxide gas emissions, which are released from magma as it rises and depressurizes, and they are looking for observable changes in eruptive behavior at the vent itself, particularly any transition from the relatively quiet lava effusion of the current episode toward more energetic fountaining or explosive activity. As of May 2nd, none of these level 4 trigger criteria were met. The ground deformation was not showing rapid inflation. The seismic activity, while elevated, was not displaying the kind of sudden spike associated with a pressure-driven escalation. Gas emissions were elevated, but not dramatically different from the preceding days and weeks. And the vent behavior, while it did produce strombolian bursting during the collapse event, did not escalate into sustained explosive activity. So the instrument said, same as before, and the alert level said, same as before, because that is how the system is designed to work. Now understand what PHIVOLCS is protecting against by not raising the alert level prematurely. A false alarm at level 4, a declaration of imminent eruption that does not materialize, has real costs. It forces massive evacuations of populations that may already be fatigued from months of level 3 disruption. It consumes emergency resources. It erodes public trust in the monitoring system, which is one of the most dangerous outcomes possible in volcano hazard management. If communities stop believing the alerts, they stop responding to them. And when a real level 4 event occurs, when the instruments finally do show the clear escalation signals, the one thing that cannot be afforded is a population that has been crying wolf conditioned into ignoring official warnings. PHIVOLCS is threading a needle that is extraordinarily difficult. They must communicate genuine ongoing danger without escalating the official level in ways the data does not yet support. They must keep populations safe without triggering evacuations that are not yet justified by the system parameters. And they must do all of this in real time, with incomplete information, under public scrutiny, in a country where volcanic activity is simultaneously a geological reality and a political and economic fact. The statement, "no significant change," is not dismissiveness, it is precision. It is saying, the parameters we use to define what level of alert is appropriate have not changed, which is accurate. The problem is not that the statement is wrong. The problem is that those parameters could remain unchanged right up to the moment they change dramatically, and the magnitude of May 2nd, sitting inside the current parameter range but at the large end of it, is a sign that the range is being tested, not yet exceeded, but tested. And that takes us to the strangest and most unsettling feature of the current episode, the plateau that should not exist. Part 10. the plateau that shouldn't exist. Mayon is not supposed to do this, not exactly. Historically, Mayon's eruptive episodes tend to follow one of a few patterns. In the shorter ones, activity builds quickly, peaks within days to weeks, and then declines. In the longer ones, like 2023, activity sustains at a moderate level for an extended period before gradually tapering off. What is relatively uncommon in Mayon's documented behavior is a combination of extended duration and progressively increasing event size without clear escalation in the deep monitoring parameters. A long plateau that is also trending upward in surface expression while remaining flat in subsurface signals. The 2023 episode is the obvious comparison case. That episode also ran for an extended period at level 3. It also featured lava effusion and periodic PDC activity, and it eventually resolved without escalating to level 4 or producing a catastrophic outcome. The events in 2023 did not, as best as we can determine from available data, show the same pattern of progressively increasing size that the 2026 episode appears to be showing. They were more consistently sized across the episode without a clear upward trend. May 2nd stands out in the 2026 record precisely because it was larger than what preceded it. The 2018 comparison is different and more alarming, and we will spend proper time on it in the next section. But even there, the escalation was relatively rapid. It went from build-up to level 4 in days, not months. What 2026 is showing is neither pattern. It is not the slow escalation of 2018, nor the steady plateau of 2023. It is a long, sustained plateau in the deep signals combined with a surface expression that appears to be gradually increasing in its maximum event size. That combination does not have a neat historical analogue in Mayon's recent behavior. In volcanology, this kind of behavior has a description. It is sometimes called a metastable state, a system that is maintaining an apparent equilibrium at the surface while conditions are slowly shifting in ways that are not yet fully expressed. A ball sitting at the top of a gentle slope is in a kind of metastable state. It is not moving, but it is also not in its lowest energy configuration. A small perturbation or the slow accumulation of small perturbations can disrupt the equilibrium in a way that produces rapid change. The system was always capable of moving. It just had not yet. The question we cannot answer from the outside, and that even the scientists with access to all the monitoring data are genuinely uncertain about, is whether Mayon is in that kind of metastable state right now, slowly approaching a threshold, or whether the plateau is actually genuine, a system expressing itself fully and consistently without hidden reserves of unspent energy. Both are possible. Both are consistent with the current data. The satellite imagery shows sustained heat. The seismic network shows sustained elevated tremor. The GPS shows no dramatic inflation, and the surface is producing progressively larger PDCs. Something about the behavior of the next few weeks, whether event sizes continue to grow, whether the PDZ margin continues to shrink, whether any of the deep monitoring parameters begin to show a trend rather than a plateau, will help discriminate between the two interpretations. But we do not know yet, and the history of Mayon contains examples of both outcomes. The history is what we need to look at next, because two specific moments in Mayon's past are directly relevant to what happens now, and they are dramatically different from each other. Part 11. Path R, the 2023 fade-out. 2023 is the most recent example of an extended Mayon episode that resolved without catastrophe, and it is the outcome that everyone around the volcano is hoping is the template for 2026. The 2023 episode featured many of the same elements currently in play. Alert Level 3. Continuous lava effusion down multiple flanks, periodic rockfalls, and smaller pyroclastic density current activity. PHIVOLCS, updating their bulletins with the kind of steady, measured language that reflects a system that is active but not immediately explosive, communities displaced from the permanent danger zone, emergency evacuations in place for extended periods, and then Gradually, over the course of weeks, the activity began to taper. Seismicity declined, gas emissions decreased, lava effusion slowed and eventually stopped. The flows began to cool. The alert level was stepped down incrementally, and life around the volcano, disrupted for months, began to normalize. That is the path that ends with Mayon doing what active volcanoes sometimes do, expressing energy accumulated below the surface, releasing it over an extended period at manageable rates, and then settling back toward relative quiet. Not permanent quiet. Mayon will erupt again, but quiet enough for communities to return, crops to be replanted, tourism to resume, and the long process of living alongside a dangerous volcano to continue in the way that communities in Albay province have been doing for generations. The 2023 outcome is possible in 2026. The data today is consistent with it. If the energy supply from below begins to wane, if the magma volume being fed to the system starts to decrease, if the deep monitoring parameters begin to trend downward rather than plateau, then the current episode could follow the same script, with May 2nd as a large but ultimately pre-climax event rather than a step towards something more severe. That possibility is real, but it is not the only possibility the data is consistent with, and the other one is considerably harder to think about. Part 12, Path B, the 2018 escalation. 2018 is the benchmark that volcanologists watching Mayon keep returning to, and the reason is that 2018 showed what happens when Mayon's activity does not plateau and fade when it escalates, and escalates rapidly, and the instruments finally show the signals that push the alert level to 4 and demand a response measured in tens of thousands of evacuated people. The 2018 episode began with patterns that bear some resemblance to the current situation: seismic unrest, early lava effusion, elevated monitoring parameters. But the trajectory after that initial build-up phase was dramatically different from what has happened in 2026. Instead of settling into a 4-month plateau with gradually increasing surface events, the 2018 episode accelerated. Within days of the escalation phase beginning, lava fountains were visible from the summit. Ash columns were reaching approximately 5 kilometers above sea level. Pyroclastic flows were being generated on multiple flanks simultaneously and with significantly greater frequency than the current episode has shown. The system was clearly and rapidly moving in one direction, up. PHIVOLCS raised the alert to level 4. The permanent danger zone was expanded from 6 kilometers to 8, and then to 9 kilometers in some directions, as the flows extended further and the hazard footprint grew. Evacuation orders expanded correspondingly. Between 60,000 and 90,000 people were ultimately displaced from their homes during the peak of the 2018 episode. That is not a typo. 60,000 to 90,000 people. The logistics of moving that many people, sheltering them, feeding them, managing the economic disruption and the psychological toll of displacement, it was an enormous undertaking. And that was for an episode that did not produce a truly catastrophic eruption in the style of Mayon's most dangerous historical events. What makes the 2018 comparison relevant and unsettling for 2026 is precisely what makes it different. The 2018 escalation was fast. The signals built, the instruments responded, and PHIVOLCS had enough advance notice to move the alert level and expand the danger zone before the flows reached populated areas outside the original PDZ. The system worked, in the sense that warning was given and mass casualties were avoided, but the speed of escalation left limited margin for error. Now consider 2026 through that lens. We have had 4 months of level 3 activity with no escalation signal in the deep instruments. The surface activity is producing progressively larger events. The most recent event was the largest of the episode. If 2026 follows the 2018 trajectory, the escalation, when it comes, will come from this already elevated baseline. The system is not starting cold. It has been running hot for 4 months. If something in the deep parameters begins to change, if inflation accelerates, if seismicity spikes, if gas output increases dramatically, The question is not just whether PHIVOLCS will detect it. They will detect it. The question is how much time there will be between detecting it and the surface behavior catching up with the instruments. In 2018, that time was measured in days. In some worst scenarios, it has been measured in hours. Is 2026 a delayed version of 2018? The data does not say yes, but the data does not say no. And that ambiguity is not a minor footnote. It is the whole story. But before we can close that discussion, we need to establish what the real ceiling of Mayon's behavior looks like. Not the 2023 fade or the 2018 scare, but the event that sits at the top of the historical record as a reminder of what this volcano is actually capable of when neither of those paths applies. Part 13. The 1814 ceiling. 1814, 212 years ago, the town of Kagasawa, nestled in the lowlands below Mayon's southwestern flank, was a functioning community. It had a church. It had residents. It had the ordinary daily texture of provincial Filipino life in the early 19th century. On February 1st of that year, Mayon erupted in a manner that erased Kagasawa from the map. The pyroclastic flows reached far beyond what modern exclusion zones would contemplate multi-gully, multi-directional, overwhelming in their scale and duration. Tephra deposits reached depths estimated at up to approximately 9 meters in some affected areas. The casualty toll has been estimated at 1,200 people or more, making it one of the deadliest volcanic events in Philippine history. And what remains of Kagasawa today? What tourists visit? What photographers frame against the perfect cone rising behind it is the bell tower of the Kagasawa church, standing in an open field, the building around it long since buried and eroded, a solitary marker of the community that the volcano consumed. The 1814 eruption represents the upper bound of what Mayon has demonstrated it can do. It is the ceiling of the hazard envelope, the magnitude against which all current activity is implicitly measured. And it is worth being very clear about what that ceiling means for the current situation. It does not mean that the current episode is heading toward an 1814 scale event. There is no data suggesting that. The conditions that produced 1814 likely involved a substantially larger and more energetic magmatic event than anything the current monitoring data indicates. The multi-gully, simultaneous pyroclastic flow behavior of 1814 is qualitatively different from what is currently being observed. But the 1814 record serves a crucial function in the risk calculus. It tells us that Mayon's activity exists on a spectrum, and the top of that spectrum is lethal at a scale that modern evacuation logistics would struggle to address if the warning time were short. It tells us that the volcano has a demonstrated capability that goes far beyond what the current monitoring signals suggest is imminent, and it frames the question of what escalation without clear signaling actually means in the worst-case reading. If the system were to move towards something in the 1814 range without producing the gradual escalation signals that the modern monitoring network is calibrated to detect if the transition were rapid from the current plateau to something dramatically more energetic, the consequences would be measured in a way that cannot be expressed through the language of alert levels. That is not the expected outcome, it is not the predicted outcome, but it is in the possibility space, and the bell tower at Kagasawa is the geological reminder that this possibility space has a real and documented upper bound. Part 14. The escalation pattern hypothesis. Let us now talk about something that volcanologists debate and that the publicly available data allows us to at least examine, even if not resolve, the escalation pattern hypothesis. The hypothesis is simple to state and complicated to evaluate. It goes like this. In some volcanic episodes, the size of individual events PDCs, lava fountaining episodes, flow advances increases progressively over time in a way that reflects the gradual build of system energy or the gradual accumulation of surface mass that is available to mobilize. Under this hypothesis, each successive event is somewhat larger than the last, not because the deep magmatic system has suddenly changed, but because the conditions for larger events are being incrementally created by the ongoing effusion. The pile grows, the pile becomes more unstable, the next collapse is larger, and so on. And if this pattern continues without a resolution, without either the supply cutting off and the pile stabilizing, or the system escalating dramatically and discharging the accumulated material in a major event, then the trend in event sizes can be used as a leading indicator of where the system is going. Applied to Mayon, in 2026, the hypothesis would suggest that the sequence from smaller PDCs in January and February to mid-sized events in March and April to the 4-kilometer MEC event on May 2nd is not random variation, it is a trend. And if it is a trend, the next significant event could be larger than May 2nd. Not because the deep instruments will show escalation before it happens. We have already established that collapse-fed PDCs can occur without clear deep instrument precursors, but because the conditions for a larger event are being created by the ongoing supply and accumulation. Now, how robust is this hypothesis? Honestly, it has limitations. Volcanic event sizes are inherently variable, and there is always noise in the sequence. A larger event does not always follow a smaller one. The pattern could be interrupted by a period of relative stability, or by a change in effusion rate, or by a natural variation in where material accumulates and how it fails. The escalation pattern hypothesis is not a prediction. It is a framework for reading the available data, and like all frameworks, it has conditions under which it is applicable and conditions under which it breaks down. But here is what makes it worth taking seriously in the current context. The May 2nd event was not just the largest of the episode, it was noticeably larger than what had come before. There was not a gradual, incremental change from the previous maximum. There was a step from the previous range of PDC behavior to something qualitatively further down the slope. Step changes in event size, after a long accumulation period, are one of the patterns that appear in the pre-escalation records of some significant volcanic events elsewhere in the world. That does not mean Mayon is about to produce a dramatically larger event. It means the question is worth asking, and it means that the monitoring data from the next few weeks specifically, whether any further PDC events occur and whether they are larger or smaller than May 2nd, will be extremely informative. If subsequent events are smaller or absent, the escalation pattern hypothesis loses support. If subsequent events are larger, it gains support in a way that should sharpen everyone's attention. The instruments will not tell us this in advance. The instruments will tell us after the fact each time an event occurs, and that is why the limitation of monitoring is not a failure of the system. It is a fundamental characteristic of what monitoring can and cannot do when the dominant mechanism of hazard is gravitational rather than magmatic. Part 15. Why Science Can't Choose Yet. We have spent the last several thousand words building a case for two interpretations of the same data, the same thermal signals, the same seismic records, the same flow distances, the same alert level, the same May 2nd event, and the honest conclusion of all of that evidence gathering is this: science cannot choose between the two interpretations yet. Not because the scientists are not doing their job, not because the instruments are inadequate, but because the data is genuinely ambiguous, and acknowledging that ambiguity is itself the most scientifically honest position available. This is something that public communication about science struggles with enormously. Ambiguity is uncomfortable. Uncertainty is uncomfortable. People want to know, is it going to get worse or is it going to get better? They want a probability they can hold on to, a prediction they can plan around, a clear statement from the experts that allows them to make decisions with confidence. And the experts, PHIVOLCS, in this case, are in the position of having to say, we are watching carefully, we are tracking all the available signals, and we cannot yet tell you which trajectory this system is on. That is not a satisfying answer, but it is the true one. What volcanology offers is probabilistic thinking, not deterministic prediction. The tools of monitoring and data analysis allow scientists to say, Given everything we observe, the probability of X outcome in the next 24 hours is approximately this, and the probability of Y outcome is approximately that. What they cannot say, what no monitoring system in the world currently allows, is, at this specific moment, a transition will begin, and you have this many hours to respond. The tipping points are hidden in the interior of the volcano, in the geometries of magma chambers and conduit systems and structural weaknesses that no surface instrument can fully image. We see the outputs. We infer the inputs. We make probabilistic estimates based on the pattern of those outputs over time, and we remain genuinely uncertain about the timing and magnitude of what comes next. What we can say with confidence is that the system is not quiet. It has been expressing itself continuously for 4 months. It produced the largest event of the episode on May 2nd. The structural conditions for further collapse events remain in place. Lava is still flowing, material is still accumulating, the gully systems are still loaded. The monitoring parameters that would trigger a level 4 alert have not been observed, and the history of Mayon contains both the soft landing of 2023 and the escalation of 2018. Here is the thing about living with uncertainty in real time, with real populations and real communities in the hazard zone. The precautionary principle, the idea that in the face of genuine uncertainty about outcomes with severe potential consequences, you err on the side of caution, suggests that the existing evacuation protocols and the Level 3 designations should be maintained and respected, not treated as overreactions, and the practical evidence supports this. On May 2nd, the permanent danger zone was already cleared, and a 4-kilometer pyroclastic density current did not kill anyone. The system worked. But the system working requires the population to continue trusting and following the protocols, even when months of no escalation create the impression that the danger has stabilized, because the danger is not what Mayon has already done. The danger is what it can still do without clearly announcing it first. And that danger does not end even if the current eruption episode stops entirely, because the material Mayon has deposited on its slopes over the last 4 months is not going anywhere on its own schedule. It is waiting for a trigger that has nothing to do with magma. Part 16, the Lahar setup. Here is something that does not make enough headlines during active volcanic episodes. The eruption itself is often not the deadliest part. The deadliest part frequently comes later, sometimes weeks or months later, after the magmatic activity has quieted and the alert level has come down, and people have gone home and the emergency centres have been stood down. The deadliest part is the rain. Mayon's current episode has been depositing volcanic material ash, fragmented lava, pyroclastic debris on its flanks for nearly 4 months. The Miyisi Gully is now loaded with fresh PDC material from the May 2nd event. The Basud and Bonga gullies carry lava flow deposits extending several kilometers. The upper slopes of the volcano are mantled in loose volcanic ash and fragmented rock that has been accumulating since January. This material is unstable. It is not consolidated. It is sitting on steep slopes, awaiting one specific trigger: rainfall. When significant rainfall hits a volcano slope that is loaded with fresh, unconsolidated volcanic material, what happens is not simply that the material gets wet. What happens is that the water infiltrates the loose deposit, reduces its internal friction angle, and mobilizes it as a viscous flow that behaves very differently from either clear water or dry volcanic debris. This is a lahar, a volcanic mud flow, and it is one of the most underappreciated volcanic hazards in the risk communication toolkit. Lahars travel down river channels, following the same drainage systems that the volcanic flows used. They carry enormous volumes of sediment. They can travel far beyond the volcano's exclusion zones because they follow rivers that extend into populated lowland areas. They can surge when they reach channel bends or overflows or tributary junctions, and they continue to be generated as long as there is unconsolidated volcanic material on the slopes and rainfall to mobilize it, which means they can be a hazard for months or even years after an eruption ends. The Philippines has a rainy season. It begins roughly in June and runs through November, with the peak rainfall period typically falling between July and September. The country also sits in one of the most active typhoon tracks in the Pacific, and a direct or near-miss typhoon during the active season can deliver rainfall totals in hours that would normally fall in weeks. The conditions for a major lahar event at Mayon are not hypothetical future possibilities. They are seasonal certainties. The only question is how much material is available on the slopes when the rains arrive, and after 4 months of continuous lava effusion, the answer is a significant amount. That is not a prediction of disaster. Lahars happen at Mayon regularly during rainy seasons following eruptions. Monitoring systems and warning infrastructure exist specifically for this hazard. But the scale of the potential lahar threat is proportional to the volume of material deposited during the eruptive episode, and the current episode has been one of the longer and more productive in recent history. Whatever happens with the magmatic activity in the coming weeks, the lahar hazard window extends well past the point where the volcano itself goes quiet, and it connects back, once again, to the central problem of this whole story. The visible signal the eruption will eventually quiet down, but the danger that signal has set in motion will continue, and it will not clearly announce its timing when it arrives. Part 17 Historical Warning. The year 2006 provides the most sobering possible reference point for what lahar events can do around Mayon after an eruptive period. And I want you to stay with me through this section, because this is the part of the Mayon story that almost never makes the international headlines, and it is arguably the part that should concern the most people. Super Typhoon Reming, known internationally as Typhoon Durian, struck the Bicol region of the Philippines in late November of that year. It was an extraordinarily powerful storm, a Category 5 system at its peak intensity, carrying sustained winds and rainfall totals that placed it among the most destructive typhoons to make landfall in the Philippines in the modern record. But the damage from Reming was not primarily from wind. It was not from storm surge. It was from what happened when that volume of rainfall hit a specific piece of terrain that had been silently, patiently waiting for exactly this kind of trigger. Mayon Volcano's flanks, in late November 2006, were covered in volcanic deposits from prior eruptive activity, material that had been placed there by previous eruptions, ash layers, pyroclastic debris, unconsolidated volcanic sediment sitting on steep slopes in an arrangement that was, in the geological sense, temporary, not dangerous on a sunny day, not dangerous in normal rainfall, but sitting there in what you might think of as a state of deferred hazard, waiting for the right conditions to become something else entirely. Reming provided those conditions in hours. The interaction between the typhoon's rainfall and the terrain of Luzon concentrated enormous volumes of water over Mayon's slopes in a very short period. That water did not simply run off the surface. It infiltrated the loose volcanic deposits, saturated them, reduced the internal friction that was holding the material in place, and mobilized it. What had been a stable slope became a moving mass. What had been a drainage channel became a lahar corridor, and what followed moved with the speed and force of something that had been storing energy for a long time and had finally been given permission to release it. The lahars generated by Reming traveled down multiple drainage systems from Mayon's flanks into the surrounding lowland communities. They carried volcanic sediment, boulders, debris, and water in a mixture that behaved less like a flood and more like fast-moving concrete, viscous enough to bury structures, powerful enough to demolish buildings, and voluminous enough to reshape entire river channels and deposit material far beyond where any eruption had directly reached. Communities that were not in the immediate shadow of the volcano, communities that might have felt relatively insulated from the volcanic hazard itself, were in the path of what the rain and the slope deposits created together. The death toll reached approximately 1,266 people. 1,266. Let that number land for a moment, because it deserves to. That figure places the Reming-associated lahars among the deadliest single lahar events in Philippine history, and among the deadliest volcanic hazard events anywhere in the world, in the modern era. And here is the detail that makes it particularly important for the current discussion. It did not happen during an eruption. There was no lava flowing when Remming struck. There was no active PDC activity, no fresh explosions, no alert level spike. The volcano was not the direct cause of those 1,266 deaths. The lahar was the cause. The rain was the trigger. And the only reason the lahar existed at all was because the volcano had previously loaded its slopes with the material that the rain then mobilized. The volcano killed those people months after it was done erupting, through a proxy, through the material it had left behind, sitting on the slopes, waiting. Now bring that framework forward to 2026 and understand why the situation at Mayon right now carries a hazard dimension that the official volcanic monitoring data is structurally not designed to capture. 4 months of continuous lava effusion have deposited fresh volcanic material on 3 separate flanks of Mayon. The Basud Gully, extending to approximately 3.8 kilometers from the summit, is loaded with lava flow deposits. The Bonga Gully, at roughly 3.2 kilometers, carries its own accumulation. The Meisi Gully, the channel that produced the May 2nd pyroclastic density current, now carries not only its original lava flow deposits, but the additional pyroclastic material generated by the largest collapse event of the year, material that was mobilized from the summit and deposited in the channel in a matter of seconds. Above all of this, the upper slopes of the volcano carry months of accumulated ash from the sustained activity since January. The slope loading at Mayon right now is, by any reasonable measure, comparable to or exceeding the material volumes that were present in prior lahar generating periods in the volcano's recent history. The Philippine rainy season begins in approximately June and runs through November. The peak rainfall months are typically July through September. The country sits in one of the most active typhoon tracks in the Western Pacific, and during an active season, a typhoon making landfall in or near the Baikal region is not an exceptional event, it is a statistical probability. The question is not whether significant rainfall will arrive. It will. The question is how much, how fast, and whether it intersects with the material sitting on Mayon's slopes in the way that Remming intersected with the material sitting there in November 2006. And here is where the concept of no significant change in the volcanic monitoring data becomes simultaneously accurate and genuinely incomplete as a description of the hazard environment around Mayon right now. PHIVOLCS is measuring the state of the magmatic system. Their instruments, the seismic network, the GPS deformation sensors, the gas spectrometers, the tilt meters are calibrated to detect changes in the volcanic system itself. They are designed to answer the question, what is the volcano doing underground, and is it escalating toward a more energetic eruption? Those instruments are performing that function correctly. They are doing what they are built to do. But the lahar hazard does not live underground. It does not live in the magmatic system. It lives on the surface, in the unconsolidated deposits on the flanks, in the material sitting in the gully channels, in the ash layers on the upper slopes. It is already there. It was created by what the volcano has already done over the past 4 months, not by what it might do next. And it will be triggered not by a change in volcanic activity, but by a change in weather, by rainfall that has nothing to do with magma, nothing to do with seismicity, nothing to do with any of the parameters that the Level 3 alert system is designed to track. This is the lahar paradox. The volcano can go quiet, the alert level can be stepped down, the evacuations can be stood down, the lava can stop flowing, the thermal anomalies can fade, the seismic network can return to background levels, and the lahar hazard remains. It persists in the deposits on the slopes with a patience that has no relationship to the volcanic system's current state. The slope material does not know the eruption is over. It just sits there, waiting for water. And every cubic meter of fresh volcanic material that the current episode has added to Mayon's flanks is another increment of hazard that the rainy season will eventually have an opportunity to mobilize. The monitoring system cannot measure this with an alert level. The alert level system was not designed to measure it. That is not a flaw in the system, it is a limitation of what any single monitoring framework can capture about a hazard environment as complex as a major active stratovolcano in a typhoon-prone archipelago. What it means in practice is that the transition from volcanic emergency to post-eruption normal will not automatically mean the transition from dangerous to safe. The material on the slopes will outlast the eruption. The drainage systems will carry it when the rains come. And the communities downstream, the ones that breathe a collective sigh of relief when the lava stops and the alert level drops and the evacuation orders are lifted, will still be living inside the Lahar hazard window for months afterward. 1,266 people died in 2006 because a typhoon hit a volcano that had already done its work and left. The volcano was finished. The danger was not. And 20 years later, with fresh deposits on 3 flanks, a loaded Meisi gully, months of accumulated ash on the upper slopes, and a rainy season arriving on schedule, regardless of what the magma does next, the lesson of Remming is not history. It is a preview. Part 18 Regional Unrest Pattern. Mayon is not the only volcano in the Philippines that has been expressing itself in recent months. And before we go any further, I want to be upfront about something, because this section of the story is where the internet tends to go a little sideways, and I think you deserve a clear-eyed guide through it, rather than someone who is going to feed you the version that gets the most clicks. The Philippines sits on the Pacific Ring of Fire. You have probably heard that phrase before, maybe so many times that it has lost its meaning, so let us make it concrete. The Ring of Fire is not a single geological feature. It is the collective name for the chain of subduction zones, volcanic arcs, and tectonic boundaries that ring the Pacific Ocean, a roughly circular belt of geological activity stretching from the western coast of South America up through Central America and the western United States, across the Aleutian Islands, down through Japan, through the Philippines, Indonesia, and New Zealand, and back around. It is the most seismically and volcanically active region on the planet, and it exists because the Pacific Ocean floor is being consumed plate by plate, kilometre by kilometre, over millions of years by the surrounding continental and island arc systems. The Philippines sits on a particularly complex section of this boundary. Specifically, the country occupies the eastern margin of what geologists call the Sunderland tectonic block, where the Philippine Sea plate is actively subducting, diving downward at an angle beneath the Eurasian and related plates. This subduction process is the ultimate engine of everything volcanic in the Philippine archipelago. As the oceanic plate descends into the mantle, the heat and pressure cause it to release water and other volatiles that have been locked into its minerals since it formed at a mid-ocean ridge. That released water migrates upward into the overlying mantle rock, and water counterintuitively lowers the melting point of that rock. So the mantle melts, the melt rises, and where it finds a path to the surface, you get a volcano. This is the same fundamental process feeding Mayon. It is also the same process feeding Taal and Canlaon and Bulusan, and the roughly 20 other active volcanoes distributed across the Philippine archipelago. They all share the same ultimate energy source. The Philippine Sea plate going down is the engine room for all of them. Now, with that context established, here is what has been happening regionally in recent months. Mount Bulusan, located in Sorsogon province at the southern tip of Luzon, the same large island that Mayon sits on, has been producing phreatic explosions. A phreatic explosion is not a magmatic eruption in the direct sense. It is a steam-driven event caused by groundwater coming into contact with heat sources at depth, flashing to steam, and blowing out whatever is sitting above it. Phreatic events can occur at volcanoes with no fresh magma movement at all. They are essentially the hydrothermal system, losing its temper, but they can also occur as a precursor to genuine magmatic unrest when rising heat from below starts interacting with the groundwater system. Distinguishing between those two scenarios in real time is one of the persistent challenges of volcano monitoring, and at Bulusan, the monitoring agencies have been watching carefully for signs that the phreatic activity is more than just a hydrothermal release. Mount Canlaon, on the island of Negros in the central Visayas region, has shown a different profile of elevated unrest. Small explosive events elevated sulfur dioxide gas emissions, and periods of heightened seismicity have characterized its recent behavior. Elevated sulfur dioxide is a particularly notable signal because so too comes from magma it is released as magma rises and the pressure on it decreases, allowing dissolved gases to exsolve. When a volcano starts venting more sulfur dioxide than its baseline, it is generally an indication that fresh magmatic material is involved in the unrest, not just the hydrothermal system. Canlaon has a history of periodic eruptions, and its current elevated state has kept local monitoring authorities on heightened alert. Taal Volcano, the extraordinary caldera system located about 60 kilometers south of Manila on the island of Luzon, is perhaps the most structurally complex volcanic system in the Philippines. Taal is a volcano within a lake, within a larger volcanic caldera, and its history includes eruptions of dramatically varying character from relatively small phreatomagmatic events to the catastrophic 1911 eruption that killed over 1,000 people to the dramatic 2020 eruption that sent a phreatomagmatic column kilometers into the sky and blanketed Manila in ash. Since 2020, Taal has remained in a state of elevated monitoring, with periodic episodes of heightened seismicity, ground deformation, and gas emission that keep PHIVOLCS attention firmly on the system. So you have Mayon at level 3, producing its largest event of the year. You have Bulusan generating phreatic explosions. You have Canlaon showing elevated magmatic signals. You have Taal in a persistent state of elevated monitoring, and you have all of this happening within roughly the same several-month window across multiple islands in what is already one of the most volcanically active countries on the planet. I completely understand why this pattern invites a particular interpretation. Multiple volcanoes waking up at the same time, in the same country, all connected to the same deep subduction system. It has the feel of a coordinated signal, like the subduction zone is sending a message through all of them simultaneously. It is the kind of pattern that generates enormous engagement online, and I am not going to pretend I do not understand why. The narrative writes itself. Something is happening beneath the Philippines. The whole system is activating. The volcanoes are talking to each other. It is a compelling story. It is also not supported by the available science, and I think you deserve to know that clearly, even if the accurate version is less dramatic than the alternative. Here is the problem with the regional activation interpretation. The magmatic plumbing systems that feed these different volcanoes are not connected. Mayon's magma reservoir is a local system, fed by local subduction geometry, sitting beneath Albay province with its own supply dynamics, its own structural constraints, its own conduit geometry. Canlaon's system is similarly local, governed by the specific subduction configuration beneath Negros. Bulusan and Taal are the same. These systems are separated by distances of tens to hundreds of kilometers of solid rock, and while they share a common deep driver, the subducting Philippine Sea plate, the connection between that driver and the individual surface expression at each volcano is mediated by so many local variables that synchronization between them would require a mechanism that does not currently have scientific evidence behind it. Volcanologists who study arc systems do look at regional patterns over geological timescales, centuries and millennia, and sometimes find correlations in eruptive activity that might reflect broader changes in subduction rate or slab geometry. But those are long-period signals in the geological record. They do not translate into a mechanism by which Bulusan's phreatic explosions in 2026 can be meaningfully read as a signal about Mayon's trajectory, or vice versa. The systems are independent. Their behaviors are driven by local conditions. The apparent simultaneity of unrest across the Philippine arc right now is most accurately interpreted not as a coordinated regional signal, but as the statistical reality of monitoring multiple independent active systems in a part of the kind world where at least one of them is doing something notable in any given month of any given year. This matters for how we think about Mayon specifically, and it matters for our central question because one of the risks of the regional activation framing is that it can actually dilute the specific urgency of the Mayon situation by embedding it in a broader, more diffuse narrative. Mayon does not need regional context to be significant. The May 2nd event, the largest PDC of a 4-month sustained eruptive episode, producing no significant change in the official alert parameters, while travelling 4 kilometers down a loaded gully toward a populated lowland, is significant entirely on its own terms. The question of what it means when a monitoring agency correctly says no significant change, while the surface expression of a volcanic system continues to intensify, is a complete and serious question without adding speculative linkages to Bulusan or Taal or Canlaon. The Philippines is a volcanically active country. Multiple volcanoes being active simultaneously is not an anomaly. It is a baseline condition of living on this specific piece of the planet. What is happening at Mayon right now is unusual within Mayon's own recent history. 4 months of sustained Level 3, progressively larger surface events, 3 loaded gullies, a rainy season approaching. That is the story, that is the hazard, and it is more than sufficient, on its own, to warrant the sustained and serious attention that this video is trying to give it. The regional backdrop is real, the individual systems are real, but each one is telling its own story, and right now, Mayon's story is the one that demands the most careful reading. Part 19. The Flank Collapse Question. In 1980, Mount St. Helens in Washington state produced the largest landslide in recorded history, and I want to spend some time with this event, not because it is directly analogous to what is happening at Mayon right now, but because it illustrates something fundamental about volcanic hazard that applies everywhere, to every active system, including the one we have been watching for the last 4 months in Albay province. It illustrates what happens when a volcano does something that was technically within the range of known possibilities, but outside the range of what the hazard models had specifically anticipated. And it illustrates the cost of that gap between possibility and anticipation in a way that 1980 made permanent. The story of Mount St. Helens in the months before May 18th of that year is a story of escalating signals that scientists watched with increasing alarm and genuine scientific uncertainty. Starting in late March, the volcano, which had been dormant for over a century, began showing signs of reawakening, earthquakes, steam explosions, and then, most visibly and most ominously, a bulge. The north flank of the volcano began inflating at a rate that was measurable not just by instruments, but eventually by eye. Material was being pushed outward from inside the mountain at approximately 1.5 meters per day. The bulge ultimately grew to a displacement of roughly 150 meters from the original surface of the flank. Scientists watching it knew it was caused by magma intruding into the edifice. They knew the north flank was becoming increasingly unstable. They established a danger zone and evacuated residents from the immediate area. What they could not predict, what the monitoring tools and the models of the time did not allow them to predict, was the precise moment of failure, or what direction the energy would travel when it released. On the morning of May 18th, a magnitude 5.1 earthquake triggered the catastrophic failure of the entire north flank. The collapse happened in seconds. An enormous volume of rock, approximately 2.8 cubic kilometers of material, slid away from the mountain in the largest landslide ever recorded in human history. And the moment that material moved, it exposed the pressurized magmatic system that had been building beneath the bulge for weeks. The depressurization was instantaneous and total. What followed was a lateral blast, a directed explosion moving horizontally rather than vertically that traveled outward from the collapse scar at several hundred kilometers per hour. It was not the eruption column that people had been watching for. It was not lava fountaining from the summit. It was a sideways explosion that nobody had specifically modeled for that volcano, traveling in a direction that the established danger zone had not fully accounted for. 57 people died. The majority of them were outside the formal exclusion zone, not because emergency management had failed in any simple sense, but because the lateral blast extended the lethal hazard footprint beyond the boundaries that the pre-eruption hazard models had anticipated. The The forest within approximately 600 square kilometers of the volcano was leveled in minutes. The landscape was remade in a single morning, and the scientific community, in the aftermath, spent years integrating what May 18th had revealed about the potential for lateral, directed energy release in stratovolcano systems, knowledge that has since been incorporated into hazard assessments at active volcanoes around the world. Now let me be very precise about why I am telling you this in the context of Mayon, because I am aware that the juxtaposition of a catastrophic 1980 collapse story with the current Mayon situation could easily be read as implying a direct comparison that the data does not support. So let me be explicit. The data at Mayon right now does not support an imminent St. Helens-type flank collapse scenario. The mechanism that produced the 1980 St. Helens event requires a specific set of conditions. It requires significant magma intrusion into the edifice itself, not just effusion from the summit vent, but magma actively pushing into the body of the cone, physically inflating it from the inside. It requires that inflation to be concentrated enough and sustained enough to create a measurable, visible deformation of the flank, the kind of bulge that the St. Helens scientists could see growing at 1.5 meters per day. And it requires a structural geometry in the cone that allows a large-scale failure plane to develop a zone of weakness along which an entire flank section can detach and slide as a coherent mass. At Mayon, the GPS deformation network is not showing this. The instruments that measure ground deformation tiltmeters, GPS receivers, INSAR satellite data are not detecting the kind of rapid, unilateral inflation that would indicate magma intruding into the edifice and pushing a flank outward. The deformation signals at Mayon during this episode have been consistent with summit effusion material coming out of the top, rather than intrusion into the body of the cone. That is a meaningful distinction. It is the difference between a volcano expressing itself through its summit vent and a volcano physically restructuring its own edifice. Mayon is currently doing the former. There is no evidence it is doing the latter. That is genuinely reassuring, and I want to be clear that I mean that without irony or qualification. The absence of edifice deformation signals at Mayon right now is a real data point in the positive direction. Flank collapse at the scale of what St. Helens produced is not a subtle process in its precursors. It announces itself in the deformation data over weeks and months before the failure event. If Mayon were building toward that kind of scenario, the GPS network would be showing it. It is not. But here is why the scenario is still worth discussing, not as a prediction, not as a likely outcome, but as a component of the complete hazard picture that intellectual honesty requires us to acknowledge. The current Mayon episode is unusual in its duration and in the volume of material it has placed on the volcano's flanks. 4 months of continuous lava effusion on 3 separate flanks represents a significant loading of the volcanic edifice with fresh, heavy material. Lava flows are not weightless. They add mass to the upper cone and the upper flanks in ways that incrementally change the stress distribution within the edifice. Most of the time, in most volcanic systems, this loading is well within the structural tolerance of the cone and produces no consequence beyond what the surface monitoring can see. The volcano has been doing this in various episodes for tens of thousands of years. Its structure has evolved in response to exactly this kind of repeated loading and unloading. But volcanic edifices do fail. Not often on the scale of St. Helens, not usually with the kind of catastrophic lateral blast that made May 18, 1980 so distinctive, but partial flank collapses, sector collapses, and large-scale gravitational failures have been documented at stratovolcanoes around the world, and the geological record of Mayon itself, the deposits and the topography that tell the history of the cone over geological time, includes evidence of past large-scale mass movements that reshaped the volcano in ways that were not subtle. The reason that history matters is the same reason the 1814 record matters, and the same reason the Reming-Lahar record matters. It establishes what the possibility space actually looks like when you extend beyond the recent instrumental record The monitoring data from the last several decades gives us a baseline for what Mayon does in typical eruptive episodes. The geological record gives us the full range of what Mayon has done when conditions moved outside the typical range. And the current episode, with its 4-month duration, its multi-flank loading, and its production of progressively larger surface events, is already operating at the outer edge of what the recent instrumental record would call typical. That does not mean flank collapse is coming. The probability of a St. Helens scale edifice failure at Mayon in the current episode is genuinely low, and the absence of deformation signals supports that assessment, but tail risks, low probability, high consequence scenarios are not irrelevant simply because their probability is low. They are the scenarios that hazard planning must account for precisely because their consequences, if they occur, are so far outside the range of manageable outcomes that even a small probability justifies significant attention. The monitoring network at Mayon is watching for edifice deformation. It is not seeing it. That is the good news, stated plainly and without reservation. The relevant question, the one that connects this discussion back to everything else we have covered, is whether a system that has been running at elevated activity for 4 months, producing increasingly large surface events, and loading its flanks with fresh material, is a system whose full hazard picture is captured by the instruments currently watching it. The answer, as with so much in this story, is mostly yes. And the part that is not mostly yes is exactly the part worth keeping in mind. The St. Helens scientists saw the bulge. They knew the flank was unstable. They could not predict May 18th. The lesson is not that monitoring fails. The lesson is that monitoring has edges, and knowing where those edges are is the beginning of understanding what we do and do not actually know about what Mayon is capable of doing next. Part 20: The real reason this event matters. Let us bring it back to where we started. May 2nd, 2026, 4:28 in the afternoon. A collapse-fed pyroclastic density current travels 4 kilometers down the Meisi Gully in seconds. 52 barangays affected. More than 5,000 people evacuated. Ash plume rising 3,000 meters above sea level and drifting west and southwest across a populated region that has been living under the shadow of this volcano for 4 continuous months. And PHIVOLCS, the agency whose entire institutional purpose is to watch this mountain and tell the public what it is doing, issues its official statement, Alert Level 3. No significant change. We have spent a significant amount of time in this video explaining why that statement is accurate, and I want to come back to that accuracy one more time before we push through to the conclusion, because I think it is important, genuinely important, not as a diplomatic gesture to be precise about what PHIVOLCS is and is not saying when they use that language. The deep monitoring parameters did not show dramatic change around May 2nd. The seismic network, which records the underground vibrations generated by magma movement, fluid migration, and rock fracturing beneath the volcano, did not log a sudden spike in the hours before the collapse that would have indicated a pressure-driven escalation toward a more energetic eruption. The GPS deformation sensors, which measure ground movement at millimeter precision and can detect the inflation of the volcanic edifice when magma is pushing upward with force, did not register rapid inflation. The gas monitoring equipment, which tracks sulfur dioxide and other volcanic gases as indicators of magma supply and degassing depth, did not show a dramatic surge. The PDC itself, the 4-kilometer pyroclastic density current that traveled down the Meisi Gully and buried 52 villages in ash, stayed inside the permanent danger zone. The vent behavior, while it did produce strombolian bursting during and after the collapse, did not escalate into the kind of sustained explosive activity that would indicate a fundamental change in the eruptive regime. The instruments saw what a level 3 system does. They reported it correctly. No significant change. Now here is the part that I want you to hold in your mind, because it is the thing that this entire video has been building toward. Accurate statements can be incomplete, and incomplete, accurate statements can create a picture of the world that is technically correct and practically misleading at the same time. The words "no significant change" are accurate. They are precise. They reflect the data as the monitoring system captures it, and they do not fully contain what is actually happening at Mayon right now. Those two things are simultaneously true, and the gap between them is not a flaw in the science. It is a structural characteristic of what monitoring systems can and cannot do when the hazard mechanism operating at the surface is partially disconnected from the signals the instruments are designed to detect. So let us lay out the practical picture that the words "no significant change" do not fully capture. 4 months of continuous lava effusion from a summit vent that has not paused, not rested, not shown any sign of declining supply since January 16th. 3 gullies on 3 separate flanks, Basud, Bonga, Miisi, loaded with fresh lava flow deposits that have been accumulating throughout that 4-month period, each one a pile of hot, heavy, unstable material sitting on a steep slope above populated lowlands. A satellite thermal record from the Mirova system that has been continuously elevated since the turn of the year, confirming that the heat flux from this volcano to the atmosphere has not diminished, that the energy supply maintaining the effusion is still active and sustained. A surface event record that, when you plot the size of individual significant events over time, shows a trend rather than random variation, smaller events early, larger events later, with May 2nd sitting at the top of that trend as the current maximum. And a PDC on May 2nd that travelled 4 kilometres down the Miisi Gully, which is inside the permanent danger zone, yes, but is also 2 kilometres closer to the PDZ boundary than a comfortable margin would suggest. 2 kilometres. That is the distance between the largest event of the year and the threshold at which the response framework changes dramatically. None of that is captured by "no significant change." All of it is real. There is a concept in hazard science that I want to introduce here, because it is the most precise framework I know for describing what the current situation at Mayon actually represents. It is called a hidden threshold. A hidden threshold describes a point in a system's behavior where a qualitative change in outcome becomes possible, even becomes likely, without a clear, observable change in the parameters that are being tracked. The system looks the same by the metrics available, right up to the moment it does not look the same anymore. The instruments are reading normal, the alert level is unchanged, the official language is consistent, and then something crosses a line that was not visible in the data, and the outcome on the other side of that line is qualitatively different from everything that came before it. Hidden thresholds exist in many complex systems. In financial markets, they appear as the moment when correlated risk becomes systemic collapse. Everything looked stable until it did not. In structural engineering, they are the point at which accumulated fatigue in a material transitions from manageable micro-cracking to catastrophic failure. The bridge held every load until the one it did not hold. In volcanic systems, hidden thresholds are specifically relevant when the dominant hazard mechanism is gravitational rather than magmatic, when the thing most likely to produce the next major event is not a surge of fresh magma from below, but the power, structural failure of accumulated material above, because the structural failure threshold is a property of the surface material, and the surface material is not what the deep monitoring instruments are primarily measuring. The 4-kilometre PDC on May 2nd might be a data point that sits comfortably below any hidden threshold in the current system. The next event might be smaller, the effusion might be entering a declining phase, the pile near the summit might stabilise as the supply rate decreases. All of those outcomes are possible, and the data is consistent with them. But the 4-kilometre PDC might also be a data point that sits close to a hidden thresholder system that has been accumulating material for 4 months, producing progressively larger events, edging toward a collapse geometry that produces something significantly further than 4 kilometers. And the instruments, right now, cannot distinguish between those two situations. Not because the instruments are inadequate, because hidden thresholds, by definition, do not announce themselves in the data streams that precede them. PHIVOLCS knows this. I want to be very clear about that. because this video could easily be read as a critique of the monitoring agency, and that is not what it is. The scientists at PHIVOLCS are not unaware of the limitations of their own system. They are not under the impression that no significant change is a complete description of the hazard environment. They are professionals operating within a specific methodological framework, using the best available data, making the most defensible assessment that their tools and their data allow. Their statement is not ignorance, it is precision. It is the most precise statement their methodology permits. The parameters we monitor to determine alert level have not changed in a way that requires escalation. That is all it means. It does not mean the volcano is safe. It does not mean the situation is comfortable. It does not mean the hazard has decreased. It means the specific signals they are calibrated to respond to have remained within the level 3 range. But here is the gap that matters. What the public hears, what the 52 affected barangays heard when the ash was still settling, what the 5,000 evacuees heard in the emergency centres while they waited for news, what the communities living in the ring between the PDZ boundary and the outer edge of the extended hazard zone have been hearing for 4 months, is that a volcano just did something frightening and alarming and real, and the experts looked at all of it and said essentially that things are basically the same as before. And the gap between those two communications is not a failure of science. It is not negligence from PHIVOLCS. It is the genuine structural limitation of what any alert level system, any system that reduces a complex, multidimensional, physically rich hazard environment to a single number between 0 and 5 can communicate about a situation that is legitimately, genuinely, scientifically uncertain. The largest event of the year happened. The alert level did not move. Both things are true. And the reason both things can be true simultaneously is also the most important reason why the situation at Mayon right now demands careful, sustained, clear-eyed attention, rather than either the alarm of assuming catastrophe is imminent or the complacency of assuming that an unchanged alert level means unchanged risk. The system is inside the current alert envelope. It is producing behavior consistent with level 3, but it is producing that behavior at increasing intensity with increasing surface expression while the deep signals remain on their 4-month plateau. The next event, whenever it occurs, whichever gully it uses, whatever distance it travels, will be another data point in a sequence that is still being written in real time. And the sequence is the story. Not the individual event, not the single dramatic moment, but the trend embedded in the events together. The direction that the data points are pointing when you connect them over time. What does it mean for a volcano to be truly dangerous? Most people answer that question with images. Explosions, fountaining lava, ash columns reaching the stratosphere. All of those things are real volcanic hazards, and they are the things that tend to dominate the visual language of volcano coverage because they are dramatic and photogenic and viscerally legible. But the real danger of Mayon right now is not primarily any of those things. The real danger is the combination of sustained activity and genuine uncertainty about trajectory. A system that has been running continuously for 4 months, that has just produced its largest event yet, that is still loading fresh material onto its slopes every day, that is still heating its gully channels with fresh lava, that is still generating the structural conditions for the next collapse event. And that is not telling us, cannot tell us, with the instruments currently watching it, whether the next chapter of its behavior is a gradual conclusion or an escalating continuation. The permanent danger zone is 6 kilometers. The May 2nd flow reached 4. The margin is 2 kilometers. The next flow will be whatever size the accumulated conditions at the moment of the next collapse happen to produce. The instruments will detect it after it begins moving. The gully will determine the direction it travels. The volume of accumulated material will determine how far it reaches. And none of those things, not the timing, not the direction, not the distance, will be announced in advance by a change in the deep monitoring parameters. Not unless the underlying magmatic system decides to make itself known more clearly than it has in 4 months of sustained, elevated, consistent, and entirely ambiguous activity. The volcano is not indifferent to what happens to the people living around it. Indifference implies awareness. The volcano has no awareness. It has physics. It has heat and pressure and gravity and the slow, inexorable logic of geological processes that began long before any human being set foot on this island and will continue long after the last one leaves. It does not know the PDZ boundary is 6 kilometers. It does not know that 4 months of sustained effusion is unusual by recent historical standards. It does not know that 52 barangays just had their lives disrupted by what it produced on May 2nd. It is simply doing what it does, expressing its nature on its own schedule, and the question of whether that schedule includes something larger than May 2nd, something that narrows the 2-kilometer margin or erases it entirely, remains genuinely, completely, scientifically open. That is where we are. That is what the data says. And that is why no significant change is both the most accurate statement available and one of the most unsettling ones. Final beat, the unanswered question. Let us come back, one final time, to the contradiction that started all of this. May 2nd, 2026, the largest event of the year. No significant change. We have spent a long time now understanding how both of those statements are simultaneously, defensibly, precisely true. And we have arrived, at the end of all of that understanding, at the same place we started: uncertainty. Genuine, unresolved, scientifically legitimate uncertainty about what a system that has been running at elevated activity for 4 months and just produced its largest surface event to date is going to do next. The monitoring is excellent. PHIVOLCS is one of the better volcano monitoring agencies in the world, with experience, resources, and institutional knowledge built from watching Mayon through dozens of eruptive episodes across generations of scientific observation. The instruments are placed, calibrated, and transmitting. The alert level system is working as designed. The evacuation protocols functioned on May 2nd and prevented what could have been a lethal event from becoming one. All of that is real and important, and yet the event was the largest of the year. The alert level did not change. The deep signals remain on their 4-month plateau. The surface expression is progressively intensifying. The lahar hazard for the coming rainy season is already loaded into the slope deposits regardless of what the volcano does next. The 3 gullies are carrying fresh lava flows. The material near the summit is structurally unstable, and the next collapse, whatever gully it uses, whatever direction it travels, whatever distance it reaches, will not be announced by the deep instruments until it is already happening. There is a kind of danger that is not loud. It does not announce itself dramatically. It does not produce the obvious signals that demand immediate, visible response. It accumulates quietly, event by event, deposit by deposit, month by month, expressed in data streams that specialists can read but that translate poorly into public communication. It is the danger of a system that is moving, slowly or quickly, towards something it has not yet reached, without clearly signaling when it crosses the line. And it is specifically the danger that the monitoring statement, "no significant change," is both designed to handle and structurally unable to fully capture. Here is the question that Mayon is leaving unanswered right now, not for drama, not because it makes for a good ending, but because it is the actual state of the situation. Is the 4-month plateau a system expressing itself fully and approaching its natural conclusion? Energy released, magma supply waning, flows cooling, events shrinking, alert levels stepping down, communities returning to the rhythm of life around a volcano they have always lived beside? Or is the 4-month plateau a system building slowly, without dramatic signals, accumulating material and energy in ways that are not yet fully expressed towards something larger than May 2nd? Something that will push the flow distances beyond 4 kilometers, then toward 5, then towards 6, then beyond the permanent danger zone boundary, into the space where the alert level system will have to respond, where the evacuation orders will have to expand, where the question of how many tens of thousands of people need to be moved will have to be answered. The data is consistent with both. The volcano knows which one it is. We do not. And maybe that is the most important thing this story can leave you with. Not a prediction, not a warning, not a reassurance, but a genuine reckoning with the nature of the uncertainty that millions of people live with permanently because they live in places where the ground is not finished being made. Albay province is one of the most volcanically active regions in the world. The people who live there know the volcano. They have lived alongside it for generations. They have evacuated before and returned after. They have built their lives in the shadow of something that could, in the wrong scenario, reach out and remake the landscape in hours. The monitoring systems watch, the scientists interpret, the algorithms process, the alert levels update when the parameters demand it. And the volcano expresses itself on a schedule that has nothing to do with human readiness, nothing to do with alert levels or exclusion zones or evacuation centers. It expresses itself on geological time, in geological increments, in the language of heat and pressure and gravity that has been spoken in this part of the Earth since long before any of us were here to listen. Mayon just produced its largest event of 2026. The official assessment says no significant change. The history says both outcomes remain possible. The instruments are watching for the signals that would resolve the ambiguity, and the volcano is not telling us which path it is on. It never does, not until it does. And by then, the only thing that matters is whether the margin was large enough. On May 2nd, the margin was 2 kilometers. Whether the next event narrows that margin, holds it steady, or never comes at all, that is the question that has no answer yet. And the fact that we are living inside the question, in real time, with real communities and real stakes, is the real reason a volcano that is technically within its expected parameters, producing exactly the kind of events that a level 3 system produces, still deserves every bit of the attention that a statement like "no significant change" might suggest it doesn't. The bell tower at Kagsawa stood through 1814 because stone is harder to destroy than everything around it. It is still standing. The volcano that buried the church around it is still there too, still active, still accumulating, still expressing itself on its own schedule, and still completely, genuinely, at this moment, undecided about what it is going to do next. That is what a dangerous volcano looks like from the outside when it is in the middle of something, not all fire and drama, sometimes just a plateau and a pattern and a number that is getting closer to a boundary, and the quiet, persistent uncertainty of watching and waiting and not yet knowing whether what comes next is an ending or a beginning.